Thanks to those of you who've joined in early. I'm Jeff Abramson. I help run the forum on the arms trade. I'll be behind the scenes here a little bit, but we are going to get started in a couple minutes. So for now, you just have this welcome screen, but we'll see you soon. Thanks for being here. Thanks everyone for joining in. My name is Jeff Abramson. I help run the forum on the arms trade. We're going to wait one more minute to get started. I'll turn it over to Mona Lisa then, but thanks so much, and we'll get started shortly. Great. As more people are joining in, my name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a disembodied voice right now. I help run the Forum on the Arms Trade. Forum on the Arms Trade is a network of people around the world, including everybody here today on the panel, that looks at the arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. Really excited to have you all here. I'm really delighted that Mona Lisa Hazarika, who is part of our emerging expert program and leads a small arms and light weapons working group within that program, is put this webinar together, is going to take the lead, and I will ask you, Mona Lisa, to go ahead and come on camera and get us going.
Thank you, Jeff. Greetings, everyone. My name is Mona Lisa Hazarika, and it is my privilege to moderate today's webinar on women at the front lines, integrating gender-based violence prevention into national and community arms control strategies. This event is organized by the Small Arms and Light Weapons Working Group of the Emerging Experts Program of the Forum, and is the second in the series of events we will be hosting in the coming months. For those of you who are new to the forum, the Emerging Expert Program is a training and networking initiative for a cohort of early career professionals who have expressed an interest in addressing the humanitarian, economic, and other implications of arms transfer, security assistance, and weapons use. So today, on behalf of the entire group, I would like to thank every one of you for joining us in this timely discussion. As part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, GBV, this webinar explores the critical intersection between gender-responsive small arms and light weapons control, GBV prevention, and women's leadership in peace and security. Across regions, the presence and misuse of firearms significantly heightens the risk, severity, and lethality of gender-based violence, both within conflict and domestic settings. Yet global and national arms control mechanisms often overlook the gender dynamics, missing opportunities to reduce violence and strengthen human security. This event brings together researchers, civil society actors, and community leaders to explore how GBV prevention can be embedded into national and community level small arms and light weapons control strategies, including stockpile management, licensing system, disarmament initiatives, and security sector oversight. At the same time, it aims to highlight the vital role of women in leadership roles who are redefining violence prevention, including through community early warning systems, survivor centered advocacies, and accountability efforts within the security sector. We are honored to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this critical discussion. Joining us today are Folade Mutota and Natalia Polaki. Folade is the executive director and one of the three founders of the Women's Institute for Alternative Development based in Trinidad and Tobago, a women's rights advocate and leader with a track record of success in advancing and protecting the rights of women and girls and underserved communities. Folade also coordinates the Caribbean Coalition for Development and the Reduction of Armed Violence, which is a coalition of NGOs and academics that work to reduce and prevent gun violence in the Caribbean. Natalia Polaki is the project director of the Brazilian NGO Instituto Sou da Paz. She has worked on arms control since 2013, focusing mainly on small arms and ammunition, studying their life cycle, origin, and effects on public security, including differential impacts. Her work includes research, pilot projects in coordination with police department and on advocacy. She was listed twice in the publication Forces of Change by UNLIREC and integrates a few advisory committees. She holds a master's degree in international relations from Universidade de Sao Paulo, and we are lucky to have both of us joining us today. Before I pass the floor to our speakers, I wanted to inform and encourage you to use the chat function to communicate your thoughts and ideas with your fellow participants. Of course, keeping it professional and respectful. And the Q&A feature to submit your questions to our panelists, which we will be taking on after this discussion. I will be monitoring the Q&A function, so if you have any questions at any stage of today's webinar, please submit them there. And with that, I would now like to turn it over to Folade for her presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mona Lisa. And good morning, good afternoon to all of you who are joining us. Thank you very much to the forum for the opportunity to participate in this discussion at this very important time of the year for women's struggles and women's leadership. The 16 Days of Activism really is an important milestone for us to mark in significant ways every year. And as the business of women's role and the impact of gun violence on women's lives, particularly in a region such as CARICOM that has border issues because we are small island developing states. We have that combination of illicit firearms, illicit trafficking, we have human trafficking, and we have narco trafficking, all of which are detrimental to our economic development and the social development of the peoples of this region. And in terms of gun violence, I think that I want to make 3 points. One has to do with the approach that governments continue to make in their response to the persistent challenge of armed violence. The second point I want to make is our understanding and acceptance of the increasing role that women are playing in the security sector. And then the third point I want to make is a point around governance and the importance of institutionalizing governance frameworks that legitimize and formalize women's inclusion and women's participation. In terms of the approach that the governments make, it has been a very masculinist approach. And so you're seeing more and more our states heading in the direction of militarization. So there's an increase in spending on weapons, security training, and all those issues related really to a suppression of the problem. So whether it's you're increasing the number of recruits that you're taking into the law enforcement and the military institutions, or that you're introducing a state of emergency. As for example, in my country, currently we're under a state of emergency in response to the violence, the gun violence and the gang violence. But it has been a very militaristic approach. And I think that we need to pay attention to the extent to which we allow militarization to be the cornerstone of our response to this wicked problem. That's one point. The other point I want to make is around women's inclusion. 1320 United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 that argued for women's participation did not argue to increase or to facilitate or to endorse or to support conflict and militarization. That was not our struggle. Our struggle was that wars were occurring and women were not at the table in peace building and peacemaking and resolving conflict. And because of women's strategic roles, because of the gender norms that we are all guided by, and because of the impact that conflict and violence has on women's lives and women's bodies, that we deserve to be at the table in terms of decision making. And I found that the response to that demand and the response to implementing 1325 has been largely a focus on increasing the number of women in the security sector. I want to pause and make the point that we celebrate women who achieve and who are promoted and who successfully provide leadership in the security sector. We've worked hard to have women in all sectors, and consequently, this is not an attempt to diminish in any way the contributions that women in the security sector make. My point, however, is that we cannot allow ourselves to become complacent by accepting that that increase in the numbers of women in the security sector answers our call and our demand for participation. Because there are a number of things happening there. First of all, you're not having the critical mass that we've been seeking for quite some time. But secondly, that inclusion and that increase in the numbers of women do two things. One is, as an adaptive strategy, it opens the door wide enough for some women to get in. But that door remains open and ajar to keep most women outside. And that has to be challenged. Another fundamental issue around that is that the participation that we talk about does not extend to the civil space. So that, for example, you do not have the participation of women and women's organizations, women peace builders, women rights defenders being actively involved in decision-making processes, and that has to be challenged and that has to be changed. Which brings me to my third and final point on this, and that is the business of women's leadership. I think it is really important that our work seeks to redefine what women's leadership is, what it looks like, and what it contributes. And I just want to share with you briefly that currently, WINAD is our 2025-2026 agenda speaks directly to how do you formalize a mechanism to ensure that women's full, equal, meaningful, and effective participation becomes the reality that we've been struggling for. So we've piloted a project that looks at establishing what we are calling at the moment a women's council. And this is women from affected communities and women from different environments, women working on climate issues, women working on disability issues. And so we're attempting here to develop a model for how women can be formally included in decision making around security issues. And so we are launching the research report in December, and we expect by December 2026 to be able to be in a position to present you with that model. And I thank you for the floor.
Thank you, Falade, for your insights, especially on the nexus of how firearms, humans, and narcotics trafficking intersects, especially how it impacts all aspects of our social, economic, civil, and decision-making spaces. Also, how you highlighted the approaches to governance and the challenges of masculinities and militarized realities that are currently being the hindrance that connects to the current efforts of peace building and conflict resolution. So thank you for that. And with that, I would now like to move on to our second speaker, Natalia, who will be providing the Latin American perspective on this topic. Thank you once again, Natalia, for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona Lisa, and thank you, Falade, for your presentation. So I also want to start talking a little bit about these barriers for women effective engagement in this topic. And in Latin America, we have a challenge that is the women's participation in Congress and in formal politics, which is considered very low. So their presence is still a challenge. And within the public debate, in general, the public security debates usually are even more restrict to a male participation. What we are seeing in the last years, especially here in Brazil, is that this scenario is becoming much more hostile. So the dedicated debates about public security are getting much more polarized and going beyond, an intense debate. To have all sort of, silencing strategies and constant microaggressions targeting the women that are participating on those spaces. So to have a woman actively participating in this political realm, it comes from with a very high personal cost for them to be in Congress and particularly to endure being in those public security debates, which makes that even more important to do so and to insist in our presence in those spaces. And we have one interesting case of an approved policy for women's protection regarding arms control that I wanted to share. One is actually more linked with our gun control law that has two interesting aspects. One of them is the necessity to do a psychological test to obtain a firearm licensing, among others, other requirements. The psychological test is one that was included aiming to assess the risk of self-harm, but also the risk of impulsivity, of aggressivity, and of hate speeches on those people. So trying to reduce as well the risk of aggressions against women and femicides. The second interesting aspect is the veto for people with criminal records of any nature to legally buy a firearm, and also the veto for people that are formally being investigated or in the course of a criminal process. And that's very important in Latin American reality, because here the criminal processes may take several months or even several years. And during this time, we need to also be able to protect the victims and the testimonies. And the second aspect here, it was a very successful opportunity to include a mention about arms control within the national women's protection law, to explicitly mention here that police officers, when receiving a complaint of a gender-based violence, they need to ask about the aggressor's arms access, if they have access of a firearm, and include this item as a major risk factor in the questionnaire that is applied to determine what type of protective measure these women will access. For example, making the women that were aggressed by someone with access for a firearm a priority for temporary shelters and for additional protective measures. And at the same time, this law also determines that the police officer needs to inform the judiciary and request the immediate seizure of those arms from the aggressor and the suspension of possible legal registries, so that the aggressor cannot buy new guns while this suspension is into force. And this last item that I mentioned, so this protective measure that was included in the women's protection law, it was approved in 2019 as in a very expedite process, just after it was adopted as a priority by the Women's Legislative Multi-Partisan Coalition within the Congress. So I think that's a good example that when the women that are within the Congress understand the importance of talking about gun control and unite themselves in a multi-partisan way to approve protective measures that can be, they can move faster in all the legislative process and become a reality in a short period of time. Of course, the legal measures are important, and now that they are approved, we have the second challenge, that is the implementation and enforcement of those rules. So we need to inform all police officers, judges, and also the general population and the women so that they know that they can request those protective measures. So this is a continuous work to keep that topic in the top of their minds. So just after approving the law, there is also this very important part of enforcing the law. And I also wanted to share some thoughts regarding data protection, because as we know, data protection with gender segregation is still a challenge. So what we are seeing, many experiences that try to combine data from public security, but also with public health services that can be an interesting source of information. And sometimes some studies that read police records or legal processes, composing an interesting sample of cases that can also be an interesting source for understanding the patterns and understanding what can be improved in the whole process of identifying those aggressions and addressing them. So there's this importance of collecting the data from different sources. Sometimes there is this need to be creative on how to compound an interesting volume of data. And there is also the importance of the communication effort after we collect those data. And what we are seeing is that, of course, the communication with social media is very interesting and gives us a different reach, but also the communication with the traditional press is still very relevant, because it usually has a huge impact on decision makers, despite also having this huge reach within the population. So there is this challenge on how to combine communications and sometimes adapt the content to reach traditional media, social media, and also the community-based communication. And in this topic, what we are seeing is that feminicides are rising in several countries, in Brazil as well. And collecting this data helps us to demand better public policies and more investment in this area. So in Brazil, 50% of all women that are killed with a firearm. So that's a very strong data, because sometimes we have this social perception that women are not killed with the use of firearms. But we do have an important share that are killed with firearms. And what we are seeing is also an increase of the percentage of those cases that happen within the home. Also a reflection of an increase of access, civilian access of firearms that happened in Brazil in the last federal government. And in this aspect of demanding more public policies to prevent and to respond to those cases, something that we are also experimenting and obtaining interesting results is the analysis of budget dedication and staff dedication. For example, we saw that São Paulo state is a region where feminicides are rising, but the budget dedicated to the specialized police units are dropping. So that doesn't make sense from a public policy perspective. And of course, that reflects who is at the table when those decisions are being made and who is seen as a priority constituency for those decision makers. So looking at budget and staff allocation is something that we are experimenting with. And also calls to action for the health services. As we know, many times women suffer cycles and spirals of violence that pass through several moments of contact with medical services. So we are also calling the health services to engage in this topic and to be possible points of entry for those women to access more, to understand better, know their rights, and to understand how they can make a denounce, a complaint, and which types of protective measures and of social assistance they can be eligible for. And finally, as a last point, I wanted to mention public opinion. And we are also seeing challenges as the rising quantity of influencers that have, guns, shooting, or militarized aesthetics as part of their content. Both are of a content that is, packed as a lifestyle content or openly armamentist content, and a growing number of women that are engaging in this behavior. So this is a challenge that we are seeing, but even considering that, what we also are perceiving is that these armamentist groups, many times they're very organized and very loud. But when we do surveys, representative surveys, what we are seeing is that usually 80% of the women are against making firearm access more accessible. So they're against any deregulation in this aspect, in comparison with 65% of men that are against this deregulation. So the women are very pro gun control, and they understand the risks of civilian possession of firearms. So there is also this need to make those voices count in the public policies.
Thank you, Natalia, for sharing the barriers of women's participation in the political and public spaces. And I think it's very interesting to see how their participation contributes to shedding light on the loopholes in, like you said, the criminal processes with convicted felons of gun violence and other civilians with access to firearms, but also the current limitation and gaps in policy spaces for women's security. I think your point on data protection and maintaining like a registry or database can be a very good food for thought, especially for our audience and researchers who are currently listening to us. And with that, I would now like to open the floor for questions from our audience. I think I saw a few reflection points in the chat, but I would like to invite you all to please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we will address as many as time permits. If I may, I had a few questions myself based on your presentations. And if that's okay, I would like to start off with you, Folade, and to get your opinion on what forms of GBV are most exacerbated by firearms in your region, and what trends are emerging that you think should be of concern?
What forms of GBV? Essentially, we're dealing with young urban males at the moment. Although I have to say that because the violence is spreading to other communities, communities that have not historically been associated with gun violence. We are seeing that trend in rural communities and coastal rural communities. For example, um, so essentially the armed violence in our region really takes place between men as victims, men as perpetrators. And more, like I said, we're drifting away from that concentration of urban males to more rural communities where the violence is occurring. The most recent concern is the increase in the number of women who are also becoming victims of gang violence. Now, we have had, and throughout the region, we've had women who have been homicide victims through intimate partner violence. Um, but that has taken place largely with legal firearms. So, for example, the perpetrator is a member of the law enforcement or security community or sector, and so they have access to the firearm. So it has largely been women as victims of the use of legal firearms. We're, however, seeing more and more women becoming victims of illicit weapons through gun violence, through gang violence. So that, for example, your familial association with a gang leader or some another man in the hierarchy of a particular gang in a community makes you vulnerable. And we are seeing more and more of that happening. We also are seeing where more women are becoming involved in the leadership of gangs. And so when you think about the violence that can occur as more women enter that space, you're getting more and more reports of sexual violence, for example, within the structure of the gangs. Um, and so it is just generally a more vulnerable environment for women and girls. You do have a number of reports of girls who live in affected communities are not associated in any way with the gang, but by virtue of living in the community where the gang is in control, your body becomes a target for use and misuse. You see what I mean? So there's a general state of vulnerability that is increasing as our problem of criminal gangs and illicit proliferation of firearms increases. But I also want to make the point that we've got to take into account how women's burden of care increases in vulnerable contexts. So, as a mother, as a grandmother, you then become responsible for generations of children as your grandchildren and so on, because of the demise of the children's father, for example, or their mother, as we're seeing more and more happening. So that when we talk about violence, I think it's important for us to focus not only on the physical, but also the different ways in which women become more and more vulnerable in a context where violence is just a normal part of our existence. And having said that, I want to make a point about when we talk about what are the barriers to women's accessing leadership roles and so on. The structural barriers within, as an example, I'll use the security sector. The structural barriers within those sectors disadvantage women significantly. For example, women did not enter the police service in this region at the same time as men did. Men had decades of experience and membership and employment within these organizations ahead of women. And when women were brought in, they were brought in to attend to issues related to children and that sort of thing. Those structures do not facilitate equity in the promotion of the human resource within the organization. So women are always lagging behind men when it comes to promotion. So when we talk about who's in the leadership, there's a reason why the leadership looks the way that it does. And because the organizations have not transformed over time in order to address the inequities that exist within the structure, but also the culture, a culture that really privileges men's right and expectation and the gender norms that when men will prevail in public spaces, those cultures have not been transformed within those organizations and therefore continue to present as barriers to women's leadership within the organizations. And I think that that I really need to make that point as we look at gender-based violence in its entirety and its range of layers, that we also need to look at structural violence, and we need to look at those social indicators that really prevent women from experiencing a life free of violence.
Thank you, Filade. Natalia, would you like to share your take from the Latin American perspective?
Yes, I agree with Faladi. I mean, so many times we mention mainly the lethal aggressions against women, exactly because these are the aggressions that we have more data about. But if we disaggregate these aggressions, they have several aspects and different dynamics. So in Brazil, for example, we are trying to raise awareness also about the threatening potential of the civilian possession of firearms. So, for example, a woman that is within a violent relationship and her partner has a firearm, just the presence, the mere existence of this firearm within the household has a huge threatening potential and makes it much more difficult for this woman to interrupt this violence spirals and to make a formal complaint and access all the public services that she needs. So there is this threatening potential, also the physical, psychological, and symbolic violences in all sorts of ways. For example, something that we are also perceiving in Brazil is the gender-based violence reproduced by illegal armed groups. Here, talking more about organized crime, factions, gangs, militias, etc., and how they also reproduce those standards in three particular ways. That we have some cases, for example, of feminicides by connection. For example, someone killing a rival's girlfriend to impact this man. So this woman is killed because of her social connections. We also have cases where those illegal groups try to enforce patriarchal social behaviors. So they impose social control on the women that live on those territories, even if they are not related with the organized crime in any way. So they have to follow all those behavioral norms, or they can be punished. And we also see many cases of symbolic violence against women. So usually when the violence by those criminal groups is exercised against women, it has many symbolic elements on the way that they choose to hit their bodies or to mark their bodies, and to share content and video of those aggressions as proofs of their level of aggressivity, of violence, also sort of way to impose fear on rivals and things like that. So we see all those types of psychological, physical, symbolic violence against women in the society in general. Sometimes from police forces, and also how this is reproduced by illegal armed groups in areas where they have a stronger territorial control.
Thank you, Natalia. We have a colleague from Nepal, Purna Shova, who has written in the chat. Purna, if you are available and would like to take on the floor to maybe pose your question, because you've also shared some anecdotes from Nepal. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, this is Jeff, the disembodied voice, jumping back in. Perna, I've invited you to speak if you would like. So if you would, feel free to turn on your microphone and ask your question or make your comment. Great, go ahead.
Okay, I have written already. Thank you very much. It's a very beautiful presentation. We have 10 years armed conflict in my country, and just recently there is Gen Z movement, and during this movement also more than 1,200 arms seized by the protester. So from this experience, I found something that um, in our constitution there is very strong provision in the constitutions. We do have 30% women are compulsory for the political parties, constitution, National Assembly, or House of Representatives, everybody in local body. We need more than 40%, at least 40% women. But what I found that there are women are everywhere. But whenever the decision comes from one man, one person, one guy, one leadership. So it is very difficult to say that only inclusion of women everywhere can control armed violence. And so it is something linked with lack of democracy, the authoritarian government, authoritarian ideas of the political leader. So this kind of thing also very, what you say, link with each other. So, um, so inclusion is very important, but how that type of participations can control the bad leadership, that is the main thing. And another thing is the leadership is formation through the election mechanism. Just for we have the election mechanism is election provision is first past the post. The political party who get majority vote, they can they can rule the country. They can be the in the leadership position of the government. So to get that positions, the main leader choose the woman who cannot speak, who cannot say yes voter, yes woman, and accept everything whatever the decision maker said. So sometimes the whole systems looks like democracy, but another system costs the democratization system. So that is very difficult to say that. Inclusion, only inclusion everywhere can control the firearms and the armed violence against women. Yeah. So we have to more discussion on these topics, I think. Another thing is uh, data is very challenging because we have
So,
we in Oman
sorry,
started to
Purna, we need to stop here. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and we would like to tell them I'm extremely sorry, but also thankful for taking the floor and to
I
share
want
your reflections.
more experience from your side. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That is my
Thank you for
question.
taking the
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Purnab. I will quickly turn it over to Folade and Natalia if you have any reflections um, to what Purna said. Is mere inclusion enough, and what we need to do? I think that was her overall question. So very quickly, if you have any reflections from that, and then we can move on to the questions from the Q&A. Over to you.
Yes, thank you for your commentary. I think I would just say that I understand and I agree that inclusion isn't all for sure. It doesn't solve everything instantly, but I think it might also be important to understand if this inclusion comes with awareness of the arms control problem, because these women might be there and doing many important work in other areas, but maybe not necessarily within the arms control theme. So there might be some work to be done regarding raising this awareness and also on to creating safe conditions for them to engage in this topic. So as you mentioned, there is a tense security environment. So maybe there is an earlier stage in the process of creating safer conditions for them to actively, publicly engage in this topic. And of course, when we talk about gun control in a more, in a broader sense, we are talking not only about the political sphere, but also there is the whole arms industry's lobby, the militarized cultures that take a long time to transform, the fight against arms trafficking and the challenges to law enforcement. So when we talk about the complete gun control model, we are also talking about those other spheres. So we might have a situation where the national norms are very good, but for example, the arms trafficking is not well controlled. So I understand it's really challenging trying to take action in all those all those angles at the same time. It can be really challenging.
Thanks, Natalia. Folade, do you have any reflections on that? Please go ahead.
I think Puna is very correct. I support her position, and I support Natalia's arguments as well. And I think that is why it is so important that civil society, women's organizations in particular, develop the model for women's participation. Because in so doing, a number of things happen. One of which is that you can hold the state to account, but you also hold to account the people who are representing the voice of women in the participation sphere. And so I think it is really, really important that we make that investment in ourselves to do the research that has to be done, to develop the models, to identify those persons who can represent our voice, and to ensure that there are mechanisms in place to hold us all to account, because that usually is where the thing is lacking. And consequently, we have no control in the governance of our country, in the governance of on a particular issue like security, and that change can only come from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Falade. In the interest of time, we would like to take one more question from Josephine. First of all, apologies, Josephine, to not have seen this earlier. But Josephine says that some of the barriers for women's engagement in security spaces or leadership in Africa are patriarchal norms and stereotypes, cultural biases, masculinity, gender bias, etc. Do you have similar issues in your region, as mentioned in these 4 points? I would like to start off with Filade, if that's okay.
And I can simply say yes.
Natalia, over to you.
Yes, we also have those same challenges, and some paths of action that we are trying to implement is to have also always inside, these intergenerational transformations that we need to, start with education for the current generations and the next generations as well. But in a short term, we are also investing into changing the mentality of law enforcement and the judiciary. So those are really important organizations that sometimes replicate those mentalities within their work. So how can we approve norms or change their formation processes to implement quotas and things like that to change the mentality of the current institutions? That's something that we are also seeing as having optimistic about a possible effort.
Thank you both. A new question has been just flagged to me, which is from Christina, who works with Amnesty International USA. She's asking, what role can activists who may not live in Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, or Nepal to address these issues? I would like to start off with, Natalia, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think there's a lot to be done, no matter where you are or no matter what is your educational background. So, for example, a few years ago, we saw many people that came from law or international relations in this field, and of course, they remain super important. But we are also seeing more and more people engaged, for example, from marketing or social sciences or data analysis. So, no matter where you are or your background, I think there's a lot to be done and a lot to, some efforts into this common goal. And especially from within the United States, what we see from our data on seized firearms is that a huge share of the arms seized with the organized crime in Latin America comes from the United States. So I understand that the national gun control is a very sensitive topic, but something that might be a bit less sensitive is talking about how to better fight arms trafficking, the arms that are leaving the United States and trafficked to Latin America and fueling the organized crime in our region that generates all those damages here, but also generate damages and risks globally once those organized crimes, of course, are very connected and engaged, for example, in drug trafficking, but also in environmental crimes, deforestation, and things that impact us all. So, yeah, I think that would be it.
Thanks, Natalia. Folade, please, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to Christina um, for asking that particular question. I think that there are a couple of things that can happen. First of all, I think we always need to remind ourselves that what we're struggling against and to change is a patriarchal system that Josephine referred to, really, that oppresses all of us, women, men, and everybody else, because it imposes these restrictions, these expectations, these demands, and then sanctions us so heavily. Um, when we do not conform. And so wherever you are, it is important really that you challenge that patriarchy. Where you work, where you go to school, where you have recreation, etc., etc. When it is spotted, it has to be dealt with. So that at an individual level, you're always working, no matter where you're physically located. That's the first point. The second point I think I want to make around your question, Christina, is that allyship is really important. Um, you bring your talent, you bring your experience, you bring your energy to change and to do and to transform. And that is really, really important for the struggle that all of us are engaged in. So that if you have um, the ability to do research or the ability to mobilize and organize people who can add their talent and add their voice to the work that's being done in Trinidad and Tobago, in Nepal, in Brazil, wherever it is being done, then that allyship is really, really important um, to build that solidarity, to give the rest of us who, as Jeff has named his this symposium today, Women on the Front Lines, to give us the fuel to do what has to be done. And then I think the third thing is you can volunteer. You can volunteer where you are, you can volunteer with organizations um, virtually. We've had interns that volunteer with us through virtual internships, and it has worked well. Of course, we're always happy to have you physically present. But I think the point I want to make is that you do what you do with what you have where you are, and that is always going to make a difference. And I thank you for your concern.
Thank you, Filade, especially your last point. We have to do what we have to do with the resources that we have. Um, I don't see any further questions from the audience. So, in the interest of time, I would like to invite our speakers to share any closing, very brief closing remarks. Whoever would like to go first.
I
Go ahead,
just
Nat'l.
wanted to, yes, I think thank you for the space and for the participation and all the questions. It's great to be here with you all. And I think this type of effort is also very transformative. So you're here sharing experiences, challenges, learning lessons learned. So all that is contributing to change this reality. And I also wanted to share that sometimes it's really hard to look in a more, short perspective, because we see terrible cases happening every day in how disarmed violence and gender-based violence is so present in our daily lives. But sometimes I find comfort looking, a few decades ago and how we can see here in Latin America how this perspective is slowly changing. So a few years ago, we would see the press and, decision makers trying to justify those types of crimes and, taking this less in consideration. And now we are seeing that this isn't accepted by most of the society anymore. So just, bring this, spark of optimism that in the long term, I think we are making really important transformations, and to call all of us to keep engaged and summing efforts collectively.
Thank you. Filade, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mona Lisa. My thanks to Jeff and to you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on issues that are important to all of us. My congratulations to you on steering the session and preparing us to be here today. Very well done. Um, I just want to say to all of us that when we think and when we talk about women on the front lines, let's talk about women's leadership in preventing and reducing violence and women's peace building strategies that keep communities safe. Our situations would be far worse if women did not do the things that they do where they are. And whether what they're doing is having a homework center in a community, an affected community that engages young people and gives them hope and support. We've got to start redefining what leadership looks like. But I also want to say to us that as we talk about women on the front lines, we have to really talk about how women's bodies are exploited in these vulnerable communities, and the fact that the rest of us seem unable or unwilling to protect her from that level of violence. And therefore, the onus is on every single one of us because we can't be complicit in what we do or what we fail to do. Let us not be complicit. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Filade. And with that, we are at the end of today's session. And as we conclude today's webinar, I would first like to extend our sincere gratitude to our panelists for sharing their expertise and to all the participants for your active engagement. Also, many thanks to the Small Arms and Light Weapons Working Group for your work in organizing this event, and Jeff for always supporting our ideas. We need to integrate policy perspectives with practical experiences to identify actionable pathways that advance both arms control and gender equality, and spotlight how women's participation in decision making strengthens accountability and improves outcome for community safety. The conversations, fostering collaboration and innovation to address the challenges and harness the opportunities that lie ahead. I would like to inform our participants that after you exit today's webinar, you will receive a short survey that we would really appreciate if you could take a minute and share any feedback or suggestions that you may have for this event or our future events. We would also be following up with the event report and recording of today's session, which will be made available on the forum's website and across our social media channel, also circulated throughout our newsletter. So please keep an eye on that. And that's all from me today. Thank you very much for coming and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.